This podcast is part of the Deluxe Edition Network. To find other great shows on the network, head over to deluxeeditionnetwork.com. That's deluxeeditionnetwork.com.
The good bad movie is now an accepted item of cultural history, and we are all familiar with the theory that a movie can be so bad that it's good. To really qualify as a good bad movie, a movie must think that it is good. The fatal flaw of Godzilla 1985 is that it is a bad movie with aspirations of being a good movie. Tonight, my co-host Justin Henson of the Movie Wire podcast and myself, Antonio of the Cult Worthy Cinema podcast, we'll be discussing our first listener-suggested film, and that is Godzilla 1985. Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert, two titans of cinematic review. Sometimes right, sometimes wrong, but always captivating. Your hosts Antonio of the Cult Worthy Cinema podcast and Justin Henson of the Movie Wire are here to take you back to the balcony. You know, I thought it was a good idea, man, that we let listeners suggest films for us to review that Roger and Gene talked about on their show. It's like, yeah, let's be fair. If you're going to suggest a film, it has to have a review. Our friend Mike, one of our listeners and followers on YouTube, suggested this one, and I was like, yes, a listener suggestion. And then I watched the movie, I'm like, fuck.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Mike. I thought you were a fan, but now I just think you're like a troll. You're an internet troll.
Well, when he came with the suggestion, I kind of was on the fence on what the intent was. And then when he said he couldn't find it, I'm like, you know what? I'll play along. I'm like, I can't wait for this conversation. But good God, this one is going to be a fun conversation because I think based on what your introduction is, I think this one will be almost our therapy on a lot of the movies that we've had from the past.
Well, you know, but I'm excited about this, and I'll tell you why. I'm not a real Godzilla enthusiast. Like, I've seen the original, I've seen a few of the MonsterVerse ones from the 70s, you know, with Rodan and Gamera. Like, I've seen those cheesy ones. And then Godzilla 98, and then the newer two. I saw the Godzilla from 2014, and then the follow-up, King of Monsters. I haven't seen anything after that. It's just not my thing. I'm not a kaiju guy. But I thought that maybe, since this has such a huge fan base, a huge following, I thought it was one of those things where maybe I'm just sleeping on it, right? Maybe I'm just not in tune with the cool kids, and the cool kids seem to like Godzilla these days. I've got so many friends that swear by these. They've got all the toys. They've got all the physical media of Godzilla throughout the decades. They know all the lore. They know all of the filmmakers. I'm like, shit, I thought I was a movie geek. These guys are totally into Godzilla. So maybe I'm just being overly judgmental to this franchise. So Godzilla 1985, I looked into the history before I watched it. It's supposed to be a direct sequel to the original, like 1956 one, forgetting all the monster movies in between. So I'm like, that's kind of cool. It's like a legacy sequel. They even got Raymond Burr to come back. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So I'm not even going to talk about my first viewing yet. I'm just going to tell you that I went into this optimistic because there's been plenty of Siskel and Ebert reviews that they just totally dug a hole and buried the film in it that I disagreed with. I'm like, no, I actually enjoyed this. So I went into this one with an optimistic sense of they probably just didn't like the big monster movie and it might be something fun. Nah, where do you land on this, man?
God, this is one that I didn't see in theaters, and it was one that I think my parents avoided like the plague, because I remember going to the video store and we would walk by this cover, and the cover just stands out on a video shelf because it is a cool poster. Yeah.
Yes.
And I remember the movie they wanted was out of stock, and this had to be a couple years after release. And my dad said, why not? Picked it up. And I was like, cool, Godzilla. And I'm like you, I don't know the complete lore. I view numerous Godzilla films, and for what it is, some of them were a hit or miss. This one, even as a kid, I'm just like, holy crap, this thing is shitty. But it's one of those that just really takes its concept and it goes nowhere with it, and it doesn't really take advantage of it. So I remember the first viewing, and even kind of in previous movies that I've picked, I was dragging my feet to rewatch this movie because I just remember as a kid with this big cool monster, even I was bored with it. So as an adult, there's no way as an adult that I was going to feel appreciative of this concept of bringing a US version of it back to the screen, because history shows with Godzilla and international films, they're more often than not done poorly, and they just go off of the mere concept and the idea versus substance, and that's kind of what we saw here.
Well, so I'm glad that you mentioned the video cassette, like the box art, because I do remember this on the shelf very vividly, but I knew that I'd never seen it. It just kind of blended in with all the other things I've seen little bits and pieces of. It reminded me of, remember the box art to the film King Kong Lives with Linda Hamilton? That was the same thing where it's like, okay, I did see that movie and that movie is terrible, but the box art was intriguing and that's why I grabbed it. It's literally like a serendipitous thing that I just happened to have grabbed King Kong Lives instead of Godzilla in 1985 on one of those trips. And who knows, history might have been reversed and this would be the film I'm talking about. But as I dove into the history of this thing, man, it actually got me super interested in Godzilla for the 80s. So we all know that the original Godzilla film, when it became popular in the United States, it's because they released it in the United States with additional footage of Raymond Burr inserted into the film. You know, he was essentially a journalist, an American journalist, reporting back to America the things that were happening to Tokyo. So in the original Japanese version, that character didn't exist. It was inserted for American audiences, and that's the version that most of us are familiar with. So this was not made for American audiences originally. It was made in 1984 as The Return of Godzilla, and they took about 25 minutes of that footage out and inserted 25 minutes of new footage with Raymond Burr and the Americans inserted in those spots instead, and they were all shot by New World Pictures, notorious low-budget schlock grindhouse machine. So now my mind is percolating. It's like, okay, were they trying to make a good movie, or were they trying to make a campy movie by forcefully inserting a very, very, very aged Raymond Burr in his original role randomly throughout the movie just to fuck with us? And I'm split because it could be either. And if it's the latter, then I might borderline actually love this movie. What do you think about that?
So to me, if you're on the fence on if a movie's intentionally to be bad, so bad it's good, then the instinct is it's just bad. So it's very easily to tell if a movie is intentionally trying to be bad, and we can see little tidbits of that. But again, we're banking on the character, and there's no added elements to make it bad. You have the campiness of the hard cuts of shooting Godzilla standing still. Then you shoot to a ship that's rocking back and forth, which is obviously horrible editing when it comes to campiness. But you take the Raymond Burr scenes, and no shock that these are inserted because it almost flows with the already bad editing when it comes down to it. So to me, this one wouldn't be defined as a so bad it's good, and it wouldn't put me on the fence on it. There's a scene we have where they're all like in a UN setting where they're discussing what to do with Godzilla, where they're deciding to launch nuclear weapons, and you have the Russians speaking in subtitles as they go over what to do, and then you have the Japanese that speak dubbed English, and these are some sloppiness pieces to it that there's no way that people would count this as so bad it's good. That's just sloppy filmmaking. It's almost an annoyance to me that they missed these aspects of it. If you're going to make a movie so bad it's good, then it should be around the main conflict of this Godzilla character. It shouldn't be the dialogue pieces of it, or it shouldn't be pieces around the human characters. And that's what really loses my confidence that this movie wasn't intentionally trying to be so bad it's good, because this didn't have a small budget at the time. So usually when you have a big budget, they have other intentions on what to do with this movie.
Yeah, I agree with that. But the fact that like they picked it up, who knows? They might have picked it up for a song from Toho to bring it over to the States, insert new footage, and just try and capture whatever they could off of it. I mean, those scenes in the UN or like in the war room, right? We're talking that is one 35 millimeter camera just on a tripod pointed at the room. There is no tracking shots. There are no motions to the camera. There's no swishes and pans. It is literally just static shots of these people in the war room. And then Raymond Burr sitting in the shadows behind, just waiting for something eloquent to say, you know, like he's fucking Don Quixote or something back there with something philosophical that makes no sense. You know, like Godzilla is a leaf in the wind or some kind of nonsense. But that I agree with you. It does teeter. It doesn't teeter on the so bad it's good. It's just bad. But I can't help but think that there's a joke being played on somebody, whether it's the audience, whether it is the guy behind the camera shooting those inserts, or whether it's the guy who's editing all this schlock together. Someone is having the piss on somebody. I can feel it. It's just too bad. It's just too sloppy and too well. It's almost like controlled chaos to a point. And maybe that's just me always looking for like the bright side of things, man. But there's something about it that just feels a little too orchestrated to be just a typical bad movie. Maybe I'm just trying to like, paint a turd. I don't know.
Bless your heart trying to find something good from a movie. And I always appreciated that about you. But to me, this one is just. I do agree with you. Somebody's fucking with somebody, and
yes.
this is nobody's in on the joke, because this is like the camera guy or the editor just saying, you know what, let's take this concept and just really get drunk, hammer this thing out, and just have a laugh at everybody else's expense. Because a lot of the badness in this movie, if you take Raymond Burr out of it, that can't lose his Perry Mason character, is so elementary. And I get it. It's Godzilla. You want to watch a movie about a monster destroying a city. I get that. But I'm going to do something I said I wouldn't, which is compared to the US versions, the current versions, where you have the characters added as just mere props. They don't even need to be there. Yeah. It's just a monster movie, a big budget monster movie. Honestly, I'm going to create a sin here where I said that's what this should have been. Focus on the musical aspect, the music aspect, the composition in the background, and just have a monster destroying a city. We don't need that added fluff of characters on it. Have the sub try and kill it. How are we bringing it down? But these characters are actually bringing down the mood of the badness. These characters are actually dragging Godzilla back. Focus on the main aspect, make a monster movie, and just stick to that, because that's why the audience is there. Because Godzilla, he gives a stellar performance in this movie, but the characters are just so dull. They're so boring, and it takes away from the elements of why people are watching a Godzilla movie in the first place. And that's what the irritation is, because we spend so much time on these characters that do nothing for the movie except for move the story along of what Godzilla is going to do next. It's Godzilla's self-narration. We don't need that. Let the creature do it. If you're going to make a creature flick, make a creature flick. Let's just see what he destroys and leave it at that.
Well, I think the bad part about this whole thing for me is that I was so spoiled by Godzilla -1. And, in your critique and then in my critique that I did with Josh Scar, is that Godzilla didn't even have to be in that movie. We would still care about the characters. We would still care about all the things that are happening to him, the struggles of a post-war Japan. Like, it really felt like it could have been a Godzilla movie without a Godzilla. The Godzilla was just the extra bonus. It was the extra icing on the cake that just made it so good. And there were moments at the start of this film where I thought, wow, maybe I might be getting something like Godzilla -1 gave us. Like when they find the ship and the radioactive fleas are now, like, sea fleas are on the guy, and then we talk about the missing brother and stuff. Like, okay, can I connect with these human characters like the way I connected with the characters in -1? But then they spend little or no time with any of the characters I actually find interesting. They just keep going back to the war room, back to the scientists, and back to the UN, back to the Americans, back to Raymond Burr. So it does make me feel like maybe in the Japanese version, there was more of that story between the sister and the brother that was on the boat, the conspiracy behind it, and then the way the doctor is planning to, I thought this was kind of brilliant, get essentially Godzilla be Pied Pipered by the sound of birds, because he was making the connection that, well, Godzilla actually has more in common with dinosaurs, and dinosaurs are kind of like birds, and he followed the flock of birds away from the site. And I was like, I kind of like that a little bit. It kind of goes back to what -1 was trying to do, where, okay, let's science the shit out of Godzilla, right? But then they step away from that completely again and go back to all the inserted bullshit. And like, that's me trying to find the good stuff in it. But for a minute, I thought they had me. Justin.
Well, what you added with the bird science piece of it, I did like that. But again, it means nothing if you don't do anything with it. It's
Right,
just
right.
one of those elements that they
It's
add
a
in.
throwaway.
Yeah, it's just to move the story along. It's like, how are we going to get to this plot point? How are we going to get to an excuse to fire this weapon at Godzilla? And you take -1, and I love that you did that, because it was going to come up eventually, is the difference between that and, say, the American versions, and even this, is the characters, when they are inserted, you're right, they don't need them, but at the same time, if they're there for a reason, and we do care
Right.
about these characters. And to an extent, we do see a lot of these characters we actually do care about. I can't even remember any of the characters' names in this, and other than them being on screen and saying one-liners. So, I mean, one of our critics talk about it. There's a scene in the staircase where um, they ask the question, what happened here? Well, Godzilla is tearing down buildings, and then there's no follow-up. So this actual screenplay is just so generically bad. I wouldn't be shocked if they didn't have a screenplay going into this movie, because either that or it was 10 pages long at the most. So there's a lot of pieces to this that really miss a follow-up. We take the beginning opening scene with the, like you call them, the radioactive fleas. We don't do anything with that either. We just have that opening scene of the ship being dead, and then the top of the boat being torn apart, which is another big pet peeve of mine, of how did that top of the boat get torn apart and nothing else is actually wrecked, kind of deal. But we get no
Right.
follow-up with that. And to me, that it does pique some interest in the beginning of where it's going to go with its creatures. But again, doesn't happen again. We don't hear from it again, and we don't know anything. So there's no follow-up in this movie. They just insert things to insert things.
And when it comes to the special effects, the creature effects, and the overall presentation of the battle or the destruction of the city, they do mention it in the review, but I'm going to call it out right now, where it's like they didn't even try. There's one of the things that I liked about Godzilla 98, where the attention to detail and the consistency of how big Godzilla actually is in this world that we've created. And the fact that they did do a great combination of CG and really great model work to create New York City getting torn apart, especially during the helicopter chase scene, which I think is one of the best action pieces of the 90s, in my opinion, is that whole scene. I'm not saying Godzilla is the best movie of the 90s, but I think it's got some really good scenes that were kind of wasted in a so-so movie. But this movie doesn't even attempt to explain the rationale behind why Godzilla is big, then small, then super big, then kind of big. Like, there are scenes where he towers over the buildings when he's destroying them. But when he gets in the fight with the Super X, the cool little, it looks like the UFO from Flight of the Navigator kind of thing, flying around shooting at him, the buildings are towering over him. So when I try to say, all right, this movie at least might be saved by its special effects and its creature design and its costumes and blah, 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 Well, no, it's not because they didn't even pay enough attention to make the scale correct. And it's not that I'm that particular with scale, but when it's that obvious that the differentiation between sizes of Godzilla from shot to shot, not just scene to scene, is so ridiculous. Yeah, no, you're going to get another check next to your name, dude.
Well, you even look when he does the footprint and you see a lot of the cars or the vehicles next to his foot, and it just doesn't make sense. But my biggest problem with the design was his actual face. His eyes, the eye placement drove me nuts because it looks like he was either drunk, high, or ready to pass out because his eyes were sinking in the back of his head. It's like he was consistently rolling his eyes. I couldn't take this seriously. I mean, I think the overall frame of Godzilla was fine. There was inconsistencies, obviously, in the sizing detail, but when we get close-up shots on his face, it's comical because it
It
looks
is.
like he was literally ready to fall over from just pure boredom of being in this movie. And I
Well,
think
yeah.
to me, that's the biggest piece. If you're going to make a monster movie about Godzilla, at least pay attention to the detail of how he looks, especially the good test is have a screen test of the up close shots. There is no way they took an up close shot screen test and say, we got it. This is it. This is terrifying. This is really going to amplify this monster movie. And again, it goes to our point before whether this is going to be a really bad is good, but we can fault it to the direction of this when it comes to the design. Again, it's like an inside joke we don't get, or this was just a complete misfire, misdirection on what our filmmakers thought was funny on paper versus what we got on screen.
Well, and that's why I think that someone's fucking with us. Like, that's why I think that either it's someone's nephew and they were just trying to launder money. I don't know. But this just cannot be real. Like, there cannot be a justified explanation of why the monster's face looks so bad. Now, it did look comical and comically bad in the 60s and 70s after they started making it silly. You know, everyone's seen the like flying jump kick Godzilla meme or GIF on the internet. But the mistake this makes is that it's trying to be 100% serious. And I think if they did take a comical approach, I mean, I think it's even Gene that mentions, hey, what if they did a Woody Allen and What's Up Tiger Lily did and just dubbed everyone, you know, or Kung Pao Enter the Fist kind of thing. They wouldn't have to try that hard because it seems so comical aesthetically. You don't need the bad dialogue. You don't need the performances of these people to make it any funnier. Just change the words. You know, the film already looks comical as it is, especially the Godzilla stuff. And Roger was a Godzilla fan. He even liked the silly ones. He even says that his favorite was Godzilla versus a smog monster. You know, it's one of the sillier Godzillas, but at least you can watch it from beginning to end and be like, yeah, that's a fun movie. This is a Godzilla movie. It's fun. There's no fun in this.
No, and anybody out there that can actually dub this movie, I'd prefer What's Up Pussycat to the background music to this one. Anybody that can make that happen, send it to me. But you're absolutely right, especially when we get to the actual aspects of it where it really doesn't have any fun. There's no fun element to it. And the biggest joke is on the audience, or the biggest joke is going to be on the filmmakers because this movie was completely buried over the years. So
It
this
was.
one was one of the hardest ones for me to find, and rightfully so. This one, if I were the filmmakers, or I would bury this wholeheartedly and never see it again, because this one I can't imagine it ever gaining a huge cult following. And you're the expert on that. You tell me. But this one doesn't scream cult following on it because, again, when we have those cult films, we have the either it's so bad it's good or there's missing elements to it. This one doesn't have both, or a misunderstanding, I should say. This doesn't have any of that.
There's one of the things that I read that I thought was really interesting. I didn't think about it, where there's a line that Raymond Burr says of, yes, I was the only American survivor of the first Godzilla conflict. I'm like, dude, you were the only American in the Godzilla conflict. Of course you were the only survivor. I know it's been 30 years since you said the lines in the original, but did you see any other white dudes around? Like, you were the only American there. So even that line is like, I think someone's really screwing with us.
Well, the Raymond Burr, and bless his heart, I love him as an actor, but at the same time, it's taken his 1956 performance, mixing it with some Perry Mason. And again, this almost feels like a paycheck. While researching this a little bit, I kind of saw an interview where he was plugging this movie on David Letterman. And it's funny because it almost feels like he never went out of character because the way he's interviewed is the same way, which tells me one thing. He showed up on set for a day that our critics are going to go
Yeah.
into, and he just recorded his lines. And I can bet that's what really happened because you can show no amount of passion or that he believed in the material either. So there's nothing here that really shows that he really cared on being there other than maybe a nostalgic revisit to his earlier work. But to me, his performance was just so not laughable, but just so unnecessary and just so bland. It's just, it almost takes my view of his professionalism back a little bit, even though I do respect the man for what he is.
One of the things I think is funny is that people defend this movie, and hey, you and I are always the first to say art's subjective. Like, you like what you like, you don't like what you don't like. Critics are going to try and give you the best overall critique and review of the film and let you make your own judgment. But like, if it's truly bad and they're saying, hey, don't spend your $15, then don't go spend your $15. Or if you do, well, that's on you. Like, shit, I should have listened to Justin Henson on the movie Wire. But there are people that stand behind this the way I stand behind other movies. So I can't really hate too much on the audience as much as I hate on the people that made this. Like, people really, really like it. Like, getting into the Reddit, I thought it was really interesting. Godzilla 85 is my favorite Godzilla. I grew up with it. I used to watch it with my grandpa. Like, there's a lot of nostalgia to these things. The Super X is really cool. Why don't we have a Super X in real life? And then you have people saying, oh, this movie's so relevant today. What with the tensions between US and Russia and nuclear bombs in the Cold War? It's like, okay, well, I wouldn't take it that far, buddy, but I think it is interesting that they do use EMP technology in 1985 to shield Godzilla as they lure it to the volcano. And in this one, spoiler alert, they kill Godzilla with a volcano. But it's just interesting. Like, you can see what you want to see in these films.
100%. And I'm not here to judge the audience. I'm here to judge the movie and my interpretation.
Agreed.
And we've talked about this before. When it comes to Godzilla 1985 or any movie from the 80s, 90s, or wherever you watch a movie growing up, there's a nostalgic attachment to how we view a movie. There's a nostalgic emotion that we have. There's movies that I know deep down that are absolutely horrible, but I love to watch them because of the experience I had while watching it. So there is an attachment that some people just have an attachment to these movies for, and more power to them. If you like Godzilla 1985, you know what? I'm glad, because I've said it before. You've said it before. If you just like a movie, that's the most important thing, is to find something, no matter how bad it is, how good it is. If you like something and you attach yourself and you can relate to it, or if you can just remember it nostalgically, that's a win for the movie industry. And that's a win for prolonging the arts. So that, to me, is, if I'm going really deep with Godzilla 1985, that's something that I would say is a positive if you really enjoyed this movie.
So this is an interesting episode for Gene and Roger. So the movies that they reviewed on this episode were Godzilla 1985, Creator, Weatherby, and Key Exchange. I've seen Key Exchange and Creator. I've never seen Weatherby, but I mean, not the strongest list of movies for this particular week, right? These are all C, maybe B- on a couple of them movies. So to start off with Godzilla 1985, the way they kind of banter about it, and I went and watched the rest of the episode and the reviews of those movies, this was almost kind of like their fuck off episode, right? Like, they really didn't take any time or pull any punches with these movies. They were just like, this is a shit week, let's have a good time.
I love those weeks because that is really where you see them at their best. And one thing we should mention is this was the summer that this came out of some really entertaining movies. This was the Michael J. Fox summer with Teen Wolf, Back to the Future, Cocoon, Summer Rental. So this one, to have a bad episode with some kind of unknown movies. This one, if there was any Siskel and Ebert summer episode, this is the one to just unleash the rage from the summer.
Right. And before I play the clip, let's remind the audience that Godzilla 1985 was also on their worst of 85 list, where The Bride, which we covered like on episode 6 or 7, was covered. So they put this in the same league as The Bride, which I think is totally unnecessary, but whatever. Here is the intro to this episode.
And I was really looking forward to this one. I thought, oh, what great timing, bringing back Godzilla, that radioactive dinosaur who was so much goofy fun when he stomped on people and buildings. I love the sound it makes when he stomps. Boom! And it's a big, big sound. A whole city is falling over with every step. He also was a reminder, of course, of the horrors of nuclear war. That's how he was created. Well, so much for those great high expectations because, and I can't believe I'm saying this, Godzilla 1985 is dull. And it's only funny when it's completely inept, which sadly is only part of the time because most of the time it's just dull, as when the old Godzilla fighter himself, Raymond Burr, is summoned to fight the monster again.
Dull might be the best word for this film because, like, I don't want to call it dumb. It does a lot of dumb things, but like we've said in other movies, dumb things can be fun and dumb things can be funny. When a movie is so dull that it lacks the ability to have dumb moments that you can laugh at in it, that's a whole other level of bad. And it wasn't until I heard him say how dull it was that I actually realized what he meant. And it's that. Dullness being the lack of dumbness in a film that you can laugh at or chuckle at or tell your friends, oh my God, I saw the dumbest movie last night. Really? Tell me all about it. This movie is so dull, I can't even think of scenes that I would want to explain to people on why it's so dull. He nailed it.
He did, and I agree with you. And I rewatched this twice. And my true test of pure dumbness, if you want to call it, or a movie like this, is to watch it sober once and then have a few drinks in the other one. If I giggled the second time, you know what? It did its job. But either with both viewings, there was nothing. I was actually getting drowsy during my second viewing watching it because it is the movie of standing around. The monster stands around, the humans stand around. And dull, again, is the perfect phrasing of this movie because nothing happens in a monster movie.
I watched this for the second time on my lunch break. I was sitting in my car and I couldn't wait to get back to work. That's how dull I found this movie.
I think I know what Godzilla 1985 could use. And that shot of Godzilla in the water, I mean, kids with GoBots in their bathtub can have more fun than that. What this film could use is a soundtrack supplied by Woody Allen, just like his classic redubbing job of What's Up, Tiger Lily. Because played straight, Godzilla 1985 is a crushing bore.
You're right. I was waiting for something to happen. I went in with a, I'm waiting for something, for a little bit of camp. I'm going to laugh. I'm going to have fun. And how bad it is. They tried to make it bad, like the dubbing was deliberately
in the
bad.
beginning,
the
yes.
lip sync is off, and that's an in-joke.
In the beginning.
But by the end of the movie, I'm thinking, Raymond Burr, he must have shot everything in 2 hours. He sits there in that sport coat, shirt with no tie, and he just has one line after another. That will never stop Godzilla. It will take more than that to stop Godzilla. Ah, gentlemen, you don't know Godzilla. And then they just edit these comments in at random. I mean, it's really pathetic.
You know what film this made me respect because this one stinks so badly? The remake of King Kong. Because the remake of King Kong was fun, it was exciting, had a good performance, Jeff Bridges, Jessica Lange, big money, Kong looked exciting. Here, this is trash.
This movie is so bad it made me respect Inframan and Invasion of the Bee-Girls. One thing I just want to observe that maybe you noticed too, the infinite variability in Godzilla's size.
Oh, yes.
At one point, he's small enough to look in a window of a ship's bridge. At another point, he's tall enough to knock over a 60-floor building. There was no consistency in scale. He can be any height that he wants to be, and yet his feet, when you see a guy,
boom,
you see him, he's 60 feet tall, or 60 stories tall, then you see his feet, and they're only just as big as a foot would be, or a human foot.
I think what you're trying to say is this movie
I don't know what I'm trying to say, except this movie stunk. That's what I'm trying to say.
I had so much fun with that. Like watching them have fun talk about a bad movie because they know no one really was going to defend this upon its release. No one was going to come out of the theater being like, Siskel and Ebert were wrong about that one. Honestly.
Yeah, I mean, you can like this movie, but I don't think there's going to be a lot of people out there arguing how boring this one was.
Right.
On any aspect of it. I mean, you can pick and cherry pick a lot of the little things of the humor. Roger kind of does to an extent where he calls the lip dubbing intentional. So there are some things that you can cherry pick from this, but at the same time, it is refreshing to see them smile while they're just destroying a movie, because this is the one where they actually have fun with it. And usually we'll see reviews where they disagree with each other when they both hated a movie. This one, they're actually having more fun uh, hating on this movie than actually watching the movie, of which it was intended to be supposedly so bad it's good. So I thought it was actually a fun review for these two to really go at it and just destroy a lot of the aspects of it. If this movie isn't going to be intentionally so bad it's good or be fun, this is what I love, is have the reviews between these two be triple to 100 times more fun than the actual movie was.
Right, and for them to compliment the Dino De Laurentiis King Kong, right? Yeah, it's got a stellar cast. Had Charles Grodin and Jeff Bridges and Sybil Shepherd, but everyone kind of laughs at the fact that it was just Rick Baker in a suit walking around trashing it old school Toho style. But they were right in the fact that, as campy as that movie might be, you can't call King Kong dull, the De Laurentiis version. It's not dull. It's got plenty of moments. It's got plenty of things to keep you excited, and it does have a cult following. I have a cult movie podcast, man. I don't hear this talked about in my cult movie circles. It's like on a deeper sub-level of cult fandom. It's like those real true defenders where they are really going to hold on to something that they love, but there's not enough of them to make it relevant in the zeitgeist. Now, Godzilla 2000, that's a different story, because that one's fun. It's campy and hokey as this is, but it's fun. And then once we got into the later versions like Shin Godzilla and stuff like that, where they started making Godzilla scary and intimidating again, and not just the guy in the suit crashing through models, then it gave Godzilla a whole new breath of life. It doesn't surprise me that we didn't see a Godzilla in theaters in the States until 13, 14 years after this, because this didn't do anything helpful for Godzilla.
It really didn't. And while watching it, and I know it's going to be a stretch, but I was reminded of Eight-Legged Freaks when it came out, where it paid homage to a lot of these creature features. And I'm like, man, this is a movie that took a premise that really knows exactly the goofiness of it, the ludicrousy of it, and just had some fun with it. And I think the 80s, a lot of these movies in the 80s, a lot of these creature features really focus on this monster, and they take it way too serious, and they just look at the main concept of the monster and just hope it lands. And that's what drives me nuts. And we even see that today, where we bank on the mere premise and not the substance of it. Or just, if you're going to be funny, go all in on the funny and just really make this a fun spectacle. But when you're reserved on just making sure that the monster looks good and the goofiness is there of the look and aesthetics of the monster, and it really doesn't go anywhere, then that's where the movie is going to really fail. So if you're going to make something so bad it's good, you have to have the intent to really go all in and make sure that all the elements are there to really make sure it looks bad. I know we have, like I spoke to earlier, the editing that's just kind of just hard to look at, but honestly, it would have been more pleasing to really forte these size differences and just make fun of the different sizes of Godzilla, making fun of the one-liners, just overacted a little bit. And with the dubbing, it's really hard to tell if that was intentional or not. So it drives me nuts when I have to kind of just say, this is what I wanted from this movie, but it's on the technical aspects of it, not the story. So that's what really frustrates me about this movie. And I think we see that in our critics as well, especially in Roger's written review.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing for me, is when I think about the retro love that I have for things from the 80s that were terrible. For example, I'll use the Alien ripoffs, right? So Terror Within is one of them, or Creature, those early 80s Alien ripoffs, I have a good time with, because they either take themselves way too seriously to the point of caricature, or they are just campy plays and they're shamefully telling you that they're ripping off another concept. I can have fun with either of those. I still to this day cannot figure out why this movie exists. It's not pulling for the camp. It's not pulling for the action. It's not pulling for the drama. I really think that this is a laundering operation where someone had money and they had to funnel it into something, because it does not make sense that it's this bad.
It doesn't make sense that it's this bad, but to me, the release does make sense because it's a summer monster movie. The release time makes sense. And this one, given the budget, it didn't do absolutely horrible at the box office. I mean, I think it doubled its money. But at the same time, I think the intent of spending the money to get it into theaters in the US, I think made sense. But the release time surrounding the movies next to it, I don't think they anticipated. If this movie came out later in the summer, I think this would have done a lot better. But I think they didn't anticipate the Back to the Futures, the Teen Wolves, the Cocoons, the National Lampoons doing so well. So I think the intent, I can understand why, but the process of how they made this movie and what they decided to add in with Raymond Burr, I will never understand. I can't imagine on the final cutting room watching this movie and saying, that's it, this is going to be a hit. This is going to make us a shit ton of money, because I can, with a lot of these screening rooms or these screenings, I can just picture the dullness in the room. I can't picture anybody saying this is going to be a fantastic movie. And I can't picture anybody laughing at this movie on the goofiness and the intentionally bad that they're trying to do. So to me, it amazes me it went that far.
It's not even marketable. Like, you can't merchandise this shit either. Like, kids aren't going to like this movie. And at least with the 60s and 70s campy Godzillas, you could have a plushie or a toy or some kind of action figure set with all those fun monsters and the settings. But there's nothing fun about this. No one wants the stupid toy. No one wants that. Like, and there's no kids in this movie, so kids don't feel the sense of danger, where in the other Godzilla movies, there's always a child or a family in danger that will resonate with a child and make them feel more attached to the story. And this has none of that. So yeah, I mean, we could go on forever about this, but I think we've made our final points. I'm not even going to give a critique for the critics this week. I'm not going to give Gene a review, because he didn't have to do anything. He literally just said what we just said. I think this is a fun little experiment in how do these guys actually react to a movie that they can't even find any redeeming qualities between the two of them for. It's not that it's never happened before, but I've rarely seen such a corroborating example of these guys' opinion both being the same about this movie.
Yeah, I mean, both of them kind of hit the nail on the head. I mean, it's a simplistic movie with a simplistic review. I mean, even when we talk about the show before coming on, I'm like, how are we going to stretch this thing into something of substance? Because this movie is so boring. I mean,
it's so dull.
It's dull. It's an hour and a half, and you can even tell they struggled to stretch this concept to an hour and a half, because it feels like the movie was 4 hours long at a 90-minute runtime, because there's nothing that really happens. And I, again, love these critics, and they just kind of say what everybody is probably thinking during the movie. And I think that is, when we look at movie critique, that is exactly the kind of review we want to hear coming from movie critics. Because like we said earlier, there's no real debate that this movie was dull.
Yeah, I mean, and I know they probably just got a very small reel to show on the show. I think it would have been more fun if they had actually been able to show the footage that they were talking about in particular. For example, the differentiation in size of Godzilla. So as Roger's talking about it, there would actually be a visual cue to let people know how ridiculous it actually is. He's not exaggerating about how ridiculous it is. It is absolutely crazy how much his size goes up and down within like a 5-minute shot.
Well, and I think they try and add way too much of the set design in here. And there's, like, if we look at the classic, the original, where it kind of has the same landscape, we kind of have the same, like, model setting, it's easy to really gauge the size of Godzilla. There wasn't really anything overspent on budget here. Here they go through different scene changes, but it's like they forgot to put the ruler out to find out where Godzilla is going to be placed. Right. And that's kind of where the goofiness is. I mean, at one point, it even transitions from real shots of Japan versus model, and you can tell the difference between it. But that's where the scaling really does have the issue. And I think the biggest glee I got from this movie is seeing the Ghostbusters sign in one of the shots. So, which is a reminiscent of a better movie.
I think it's funny, like, just thinking that maybe the model guys and the guys building the sets never talked to the costume guys, and the guy shows up on the day and he's like, ah, shit, I'm like 2 feet too small for this thing. Anyway, well, Mike, I'm sorry if we destroyed your movie in this conversation, but I think that's what you intended, because between their review and my initial feelings and the very little evidence that I found online of people actually liking this movie, I feel like we didn't say anything that hasn't already been said 1,000 times.
But Mike, if you liked it, I look up to you, because I had the biggest struggle trying to find something to like about this movie. And I think me and Antonio both try and find something to like about this movie, but unfortunately,
me especially,
I'm
the guilty one.
Hey,
I will polish a turd all day.
You know what? You're probably going to be his biggest fan if you like this movie, because at least you tried to defend this. I just absolutely hated this movie.
All right. Well, I mean, that is enough of that. All right. So now that we have just destroyed this bad movie, everyone, thank you for watching, listening. Please jump onto our YouTube, like, review, rate, subscribe. Do the same for our shows. Remember, I'm Antonio, host of the Cult Worthy Cinema Podcast, with my co-host,
Justin Henson of the Movie Wire Podcast.
And we will see you next week.
See you next week.